Hello YouTube people, and that guy, you know who you are. After my previous video on the Beast in Revelation 13, I got into a couple of discussions with some fine people who disagree with my interpretation. Which is great, don't get me wrong. I love to dig in and challenge my assumptions because, as we all know, iron sharpens iron. And one of the big questions that comes out of this whole topic is simple. When was Revelation written? The majority of scholars believe it to be in the 90s, somewhere around 95 AD, when Domitian was persecuting Christians. But there is a sizable number of scholars who believe it to be before the destruction of Jerusalem, and they usually set the date around 65 AD, right around the time Nero began to persecute Christians. What we do know is that Revelation 1:9 says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So it seems clear that there was some kind of persecution going on, and Revelation itself says John was on the island of Patmos, which was a penal colony during Roman times. The question therefore is, which emperor sent him there? Here's where things begin to get tricky. See, we know from Roman sources themselves that Nero persecuted Christians, because the Roman historians talk about it. Tacitus in Annals 15.44 points out that no matter how many banquets and vigils Nero did, people believed the fire in Rome was set by his order. Quoting Tacitus, therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty under the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs. Or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle and gave an exhibition in his circus, mixing with the crowd in the habit of a charioteer or mounted on his car. Hence, in spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, there arose a sentiment of pity, due to the impression that they were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. Tacitus is clear about the brutality of the persecution Nero inflicted, and not only that, but Tacitus is also not sympathetic to Christianity, calling it a pernicious superstition. It should also be noted that Tacitus lived during the time of Nero, so he was eyewitness to these events, even though he was a young child at that point. Tacitus was born in 56 AD, so by the time of Nero's persecution he would have been about 8 years old. Tacitus also would later serve as a lawyer in Rome during the reign of Domitian, which is important because he does not say anything about the persecution of Christians under Domitian. Not only that, Pliny the Younger, who also served as a lawyer during the reign of Domitian, which lasted from 81 to 96 AD to give you some context, later wrote in a letter to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD, where he said, quote, It is my custom, sir, to refer to you in all cases where I do not feel sure, for who can better direct my doubts or inform my ignorance? I have never been present at any legal examination of the Christians, and I do not know, therefore, what are the usual penalties passed upon them, or the limits of those penalties, or how searching an inquiry should be made. The reference for that is Pliny's Letters, Book 10, number 96. And again, Pliny served in Rome during the reign of Domitian, including being a tribune in 91 AD. If there was a widespread persecution of Christians during the time of Domitian, it seems highly unlikely that Pliny would have never been present at a legal examination of a Christian. So indeed, where do we get the idea that Domitian persecuted Christians? There isn't a single pagan historian from the time who says this happened, and as we saw before, they had no trouble stating it when Nero did it. Instead, the first historical reference of it is from Eusebius's church history, and he wasn't even born until the 260s. Even then, Eusebius's condemnation of Domitian is quite tepid if it's meant to be a great persecution. In fact, in Book 3, Chapter 20 of Church History, Eusebius cites Tertullian, who was born around 160 AD, as saying, quote, Domitian also, who possessed a share of Nero's cruelty, attempted once to do the same thing that the latter did. But because he had, I suppose, some intelligence, he very soon ceased, and even recalled those whom he had banished. End quote. Again, this is Eusebius claiming to quote Tertullian, but we don't have the actual text from Tertullian. That's not uncommon given how difficult it can be to maintain ancient records. And there's no reason to doubt Tertullian did say that, But note, Tertullian apparently didn't think Domitian was anywhere near as bad as Nero was, having just a share of Nero's cruelty. And not only that, but he is said to have quickly ceased his persecution, which consisted mainly of banishments, not the killing of Christians. In fact, based on what Eusebius says here, Domitian was nowhere near as cruel towards Christians as Nero was. And if Revelation was written around 95 AD, as is often claimed, well, Domitian's reign ended in 96. And according to Eusebius, just a paragraph after quoting Tertullian, quote, "It was at this time that the Apostle John returned from his banishment in the island." That's in Church History 3:20-11. If John wrote Revelation about a huge persecution that was soon to come, it seems odd that it was literally only a year before it was all over. And not only that, but it was a persecution that was a drop in the bucket compared to what they had just gone through 30 years prior. On the other hand, if Revelation was written before the fall of Jerusalem, then the destruction of Jerusalem fits to a T. And that level of persecution fits with the timeline of Revelation too. But let's dig even deeper. If we look into the text of Revelation itself, does it give us any reason to think it was written before the destruction of the temple? Indeed it does. Revelation 11:1-2 says, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. We can clearly see from this that the temple exists at the time John is said to measure it. Not only that, but this is clearly the temple in the city of Jerusalem, since it's said to be the holy city. And not only that, but it was be trampled by the nations for 42 months, exactly like what happened in the fall of Jerusalem. Furthermore, we have the present tense listed of, quote, "those who worship there." That's present tense. If John was writing this in 95 AD, the temple would have been destroyed for over 15 years. Surely that would have been odd, and surely he would have mentioned something about it, right? I mean, it would be like if you had a revelation from God now, and he told you to go to the Big Apple and measure the World Trade Center and those who work there. You clearly know those buildings were destroyed, and yet you make no mention of it when you talk about the revelation? How could that even happen? In addition to that, in Revelation 21:22, when John is speaking of the temple in the new heavens and the new earth, he says, "And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb." This contrasts the heavenly city from the city of Jerusalem. But if John wrote this after 70 AD, there was already no temple in the physical city of Jerusalem. So this point of distinction seems rather pointless. Is it possible to narrow down the date range further than just before 70 AD? I think so. In Revelation 17, we get more information about another beast. This beast has many similarities with the first beast mentioned in Revelation 13, and it may even be the same beast. That said, there are some minor differences, and we know that there are two beasts in Revelation 13, so this one could be a third beast, or, like I said, maybe it's just the first beast again. Either way, we are given specific information in Revelation 17 about this beast, which is called the Scarlet Beast, in verse 3, which the prostitute Babylon is writing. Starting in verse 9, we're told, "This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while." Now the 7 mountains are almost certainly a reference to Rome, the city on the 7 hills. So the reference to the kings would make most sense if those are emperors. 5 have already fallen, and the first 5 emperors of Rome were Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Immediately after Nero's death, Galba took power in 68 AD. He was murdered by his Praetorian Guard on January 15th, 69 AD. At that point, Otho took over, and indeed he only reigned for 91 days before he committed suicide after losing the Battle of Bedriacum. So that would fit, and that would put the date of Revelation around 68 AD. However, there are 2 other potential meanings here that actually fit quite well too. First, since there was the year of the 4 emperors, which technically took about a year and a half before Vespasian took control, it's possible that Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, the 3 other emperors that didn't last long, were not counted. That would make Vespasian the 6th king, and his son Titus would be the 7th, who lasted the short time. And in fact, Titus only ruled for just over 2 years before his brother murdered him. So not counting those emperors during the year of the 4 emperors, Titus's was the shortest reign of an emperor up to that point. If that is the reckoning, then that would put the writing of Revelation around 69 AD, the year before the fall of Jerusalem. But there is one final way of measuring this, which I actually tend to believe. See, we started with Augustus as the first king mentioned because Augustus was the first emperor. However, he was not the first Caesar, that being Julius Caesar. You might not know this, but Julius Caesar was not an emperor. He was a dictator. He adopted his nephew as a son, and his nephew being Augustus was the first to be emperor. But Caesar was the man who destroyed the Roman Republic completely, setting himself up as a ruler for life. So he was emperor in all but name. If you count starting with him, which many of the ancient historians did, then Nero would have been the sixth king who was currently ruling when Revelation was written. After him would have been Galba, who indeed ruled only a short time before his murder by Otho. Under this view, Revelation could have been written as early as 54 AD, although that's a bit unlikely. Rather, it does fit into the view that Revelation was written about 65 AD. That would fit it, and a number of scholars do hold to that view. The lack of precision here can be quite frustrating, to say the least. But what's interesting is that no matter how you cut it, if the beast in Revelation 17 is referring to Roman rulers, as it almost without a doubt is, then no matter how you cut it, Revelation would have had to have been written before 70 AD. Again, I lean towards the view that the emperor count begins with Julius Caesar, because I do think that makes the most sense, and there's reason to expect that it is Nero who put John on Patmos. One thing I should note is that one of my friends did ask me how I deal with the end of Revelation 17 and Revelation 19, specifically with the fact that the beast warred against the Lamb. The specific question asked was, on the Preter's view, when did that happen? To start with, I do want to clarify that while I think the vast majority of Revelation happened at the fall of Jerusalem, because I take the text itself seriously and it says the events would soon occur and so on, it's for that same reason that I argue that not all of Revelation was fulfilled at 70 AD. An obvious case in point is the millennium in Revelation 20, which cannot have possibly been finished by the fall of Jerusalem, because there's literally not enough time for anything to be said to be a millennium in between the writing of Revelation and the fall of Jerusalem, clearly. Likewise, when we look back at Revelation 17, we see a textual clue that informs us that the war with the Lamb does not occur before the fall of Jerusalem, but instead after it. Look at verse 12 through 14. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. So here are 10 kings who do not yet have power. Now, what I find interesting is that after the year of the 4 emperors, when Vespasian becomes emperor, he established the Flavian dynasty, which consisted of himself, Titus, and then Domitian. After Domitian was killed, the Nerva Antonine dynasty is established. That consisted of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius, and finally ended with Commodus. So the Flavian dynasty was 3 emperors, and the Nerva Antonine dynasty consisted of 7. So that's 10 emperors in those 2 dynasties, starting immediately after the fall of Jerusalem. And while the persecution of Christians was not as extreme as it was under Nero, as we've established, it's certainly the case that the empire fought against Christians. After all, continuing with that letter from Pliny the Younger I mentioned earlier, when he wrote to Trajan asking about how he should penalize Christians, he says specifically, quote, "This is the plan which I have adopted in the case of those Christians who have been brought before me. I ask them whether they are Christians. If they say yes, then I repeat the question a second and a third time, warning them of the penalties it entails. And if they still persist, I order them to be taken away to prison. For I do not doubt that, whatever the character of the crime may be which they confess, their pertinacity and inflexible obstinacy certainly ought to be punished." And later Pliny speaks of those who recanted, saying of them, "Those who denied that they were or had been Christians and called upon the gods in the usual formula, reciting the words after me, those who offered incense and wine before your image," and remember he's writing to Trajan, "which I had given orders to be brought forward for this purpose, together with the statues of the deities, all such I considered should be discharged, especially as they cursed the name of Christ, which it is said, those who are really Christians cannot be induced to do." And later on he says, "They all worshipped your image and the statues of the deities and cursed the name of Christ." So clearly, this being done during the reign of Trajan indicates that there was a war between those rulers and the Lamb. So what happened when this culminated in the death of Commodus, the 10th ruler since the fall of Jerusalem? Well, remember how there was the year of the 4 emperors after the death of Nero? After Commodus was murdered, Rome received the year of the 5 emperors, which basically happened because there was a huge civil war and 5 different generals vied to become emperor. Septimius Severus eventually seized power in 211 AD, but by 235 his grandnephew was murdered by the army, and Rome plunged into what is called the crisis of the 3rd century. The crisis didn't end until Diocletian took power in 286, and he broke up the Roman Empire with a tetrarchy that split the empire into 2 halves, the East and the West. It remained split until Constantine the Great took power in 306 over the West, and then in 324 over both the East and the West. Constantine the Great, it must be noted, was the first Christian emperor of Rome. In other words, after that 10th emperor counted from the fall of Jerusalem had been murdered, Rome was plunged into a series of civil wars that they never recovered from until it had been so fractured that the very religion that they were seeking to crush was established by the rule of a Christian emperor. So if you ask me, when did the beast war against the lamb and the lamb conquer the beast? I respond, the beast warred against the lamb from the time of Vespasian on, and the lamb conquered the beast so completely that upon the death of that last king, Rome plunged into a civil war, and less than a century later, it was ruled by Christianity. All of this ultimately culminates in Revelation 19, where we read, starting in verse 19, "And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image." Fitting with the motif we've already established, I believe this constitutes the fall of Rome, when it was completely overrun and cast down by the barbarian hordes. The destruction of Rome certainly didn't kill off the Christian church. In fact, it liberated Christianity to such an extent that anybody who objectively looks at history from this point on would clearly see that Christianity was the most dominant force shaping the world from that point on. In fact, I suspect this is when the 1,000-year reign of Christ began in Revelation 20. In fact, we know that in the reign, Satan is bound up in the pit, and John gives a specific reason, quote, "so that he might not deceive the nations any longer." It's not until the end of that reign that we are told in Revelation 27, "And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations." In both cases, Satan's role is deceiving nations. Now, I'm not going to be dogmatic on this point, but I think that matches up with what we see in history on the broad level. From roughly 400 AD up to around the middle of the 1800s, it was pretty clear that Christianity influenced the scope of the vast majority of history. Sure, there were struggles throughout. You had the Islamic invasions, the Crusades, things like that. But the general trend was towards a Christianization of the world. Then, around the middle of the 1800s or so, there were several events that took place. Darwinism came about, secularism began to rise, Marxism was formed, and we entered into the bloodiest wars of human history. Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic on what any of this means, but it certainly looks like Satan was bound for a long time and kept from deceiving all the nations, only to relatively recently have been released once more. But again, that gets more into speculation than I'm really comfortable with. In the end, I look at the events of Revelation like this. There are dozens and dozens of data points that line up precisely with the events that happened by the fall of Jerusalem, and there are more data points that line up with events that would have happened right after the fall too. There's a great consistency throughout all this, but there are also gaps. The historical record is not perfect. The symbolism of Revelation is difficult to always understand. But if my view matches a good 90% of what's there, well, I'm confident that the missing 10% is probably not going to contradict my view, even if I can't prove exactly what it means. As long as it doesn't directly contradict my view, not being able to explain something is just an argument from silence. And as the old saying goes, absence of proof is not proof of absence. As a result, I'm quite comfortable taking the orthodox preterist view. I would disagree with the full preterist view that claims everything has finished already, because again, the text itself tells us some of these things happen after Jerusalem falls. But given the amount of evidence we have, it seems quite plain to me that even the full preterist view is far more accurate than any of the myriad futurist views that are out there today.